Welcome, everyone, to the Liberty Classroom course, History of Economic Thought 1, Classical Economics and the Marginal Revolution. I'm your instructor, Robert Murphy. We are now on Lecture 11, Jean-Baptiste Say, or J.B. Say, as he's often called. Very important figure in the history of economic thought, in particular, of course, contributing to the French tradition. J.B. Say was from 1767 to 1832. Now, for those of you who are following along the PowerPoint presentation, you're in for a treat because I went to Google image search. That's where I'm getting the headshots for the economists as I put them in the PowerPoint slides. And I went innocently enough to Google image search and typed in J.B. space Say for Jean-Baptiste Say. And lo and behold, look what pops up. So for those of you who are driving and can be spared this heresy, it's a picture of Justin Bieber. Like there's a bunch of memes, and I was like, why is Google Image showing me Justin Bieber? And it's because the meme says, it shows a picture of Bieber, and then at the top says, what does JB say? So it's short for Justin Bieber. It's abbreviating his name. What does JB say at the top? And then at the bottom it says, baby, 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 oh, like baby, baby, oh. So apparently that's one of Mr. Bieber's contributions to musical history. But we're not talking about Bieber in this lecture. We're talking about the original JB. JB was dropping rhymes before it was cool. Okay, so some more biographical information besides the fact that he's not Bieber. JB Say was born in Lyons, which is in France, finished his education in England. He worked for a merchant, then back to France to work for a life assurance company. Part of what he did was he explained the doctrines of Adam Smith to the general public in both America and Europe. Okay, so even though in a minute here I'm going to make sure you guys understand that certainly from a Rothbardian perspective in particular, we don't want to just lump all of the classical economists together and say that, oh yeah, they all thought the same way, that there's a distinct tradition you can see in both the British and French lines. Nonetheless, J.B. Say himself was very complimentary to Adam Smith. Say also had a correspondence with Ricardo and Malthus. He was a co-founder of the first business school. So Say's major work is a treatise on political economy. Of course, I'm translating from the French, and that came out in 1803. So as I said, let me just spend a minute here to make sure you guys aren't getting lost. It was tricky for me in constructing the sequence for this course to figure out the order of, which economist do I discuss first. To do it strictly in a chronological order, I thought might be a little bit confusing, so we did bounce around a little bit. So that's why, if you have the video in front of you, you can see I have this nice slide with a column on the left saying the French, and then I also put in parentheses the Irish tradition because of Cantillon. So I'll go ahead and read this. On the left side, I have the French or Irish tradition. So it's Cantillon's essay, which we've covered, which we think he wrote in 1730, but was not perhaps circulated until 1755. Turgot's Reflections, again, that distinction of writing and people seeing it, 1766 or 1769. Say's treatise, which we're covering now in this lecture, was 1803. And then Frederick Bastiat's Economic Sophisms, 1845. So we'll have more to say about Bastiat. So juxtaposed with that, there's now the British tradition. So David Hume's essays came out in 1742. Smith's Wealth of Nations, of course, 1776. Malthus's famous population essay, 1798. Ricardo's Principles, 1817. And John Stuart Mill's Principles, 1848. All right, so those are you have all those dates in one spot, and you can see the back and forth. Again, in this course, we're going to hit all of these things I just mentioned, some of which we already have covered, but it's not going to necessarily be strictly chronological order. For example, I wanted to put Say and Bastiat together for obvious reasons. Okay, and as I say, it's different economists have different perspectives. Murray Rothbard in particular, coming from his Austrian free market perspective, thinks that there's a much richer tradition if you read the Irish and French economists, and likes what they had to do. For one thing, they focused more on utility than the British classicals, who focused more on objective inputs of cost. All right, so we'll talk more about that in future lectures, but I wanted to make sure you didn't get lost at this point and you saw the big picture. Okay, so the big thing here for this lecture, we're going to be talking about what's called Say's Law. Let's cut right to the chase. And the famous way that this can be summarized is to say supply creates its own demand. If you grabbed a random economist who wasn't a historian of economic thought and you said, hey, what is Say's Law? He or she would probably say or possibly say, I don't know. I have no idea what you're talking about. I just do my general equilibrium theory, or I'm a trade economist. I have no idea. Or if the person who was familiar with it would say, oh, supply creates its own demand. Right? So that's what most people think of as Say's Law. So there is an element of truth in that. We'll see why someone might think that's a fair summary. And in fact, some of J.B. Say's fans think that that's a fine summary. But taking at face value to say supply creates its own demand, that seems kind of a weird thing to say, doesn't it? If I if I supply the market with pizzas that have dead mice on the top, nobody's going to demand that, right? So that's clearly not what J.B. Say meant. So let's first just go through, without prejudicing the discussion too much by me talking about what other people think he meant, let's just jump in and look at his actual words, and I'll try to be neutral and get you to see things from his perspective. Because in my opinion, I think what he was trying to say is pretty straightforward, and it's a valuable insight. If you've never heard someone walk you down this chain of reasoning, it's pretty eye-opening. It certainly was for me when I first read him. I guess it was when I was an undergrad, and I think some of the later disputes might be missing the point. Okay, so Say starts out this discussion of the law of markets by talking about things from the perspective of the average merchant or shopkeeper. So now I'm quoting Say. It is common to hear adventurers in the different channels of industry assert that their difficulty lies not in the production, but in the disposal of commodities, that products would always be abundant if there were but a ready demand or market for them. When the demand for their commodities is slow, difficult, and productive of little advantage, they pronounce money to be scarce. The grand object of their desire is a consumption brisk enough to quicken sales and keep up prices. All right, so again, that's J.B. Say paraphrasing or distilling this typical complaint he hears from actual business people whenever business is slow, that their diagnosis of the problem is to say, oh, if only my customers had more money. If only there were more people willing to spend and buy my stuff, I would be happy to expand production. Right? So if there's unemployment, if there's a general recession, a poor business climate, well, gee, the way we fix this is, I know for myself and my other business owner friends, we would be happy to hire more workers and to crank up output. We have the capacity to do so, but we just know there's not going to be enough customers to pay us the money to buy this stuff, so it's not worthwhile to produce it all. So it seems like, from that narrow perspective, the way you fix this down economy is to get more money in the hands of the buying public, and they can jumpstart things. So already you can see why you can probably anticipate that J.B. Say is going to say that analysis is very superficial. And you would be right if you anticipated that. And so you can see why later economists are going to have such arguments over this, because this gets to the heart of modern disputes between Keynesians and critics of Keynesianism. All right, so Say, to start unpacking the fallacy in what he perceived in the businessman's diagnosis, first of all, makes a very sort of classical economics point that from one perspective, or from a certain level of analysis, money is really just a vehicle that effects the more fundamental barter transactions, the exchange of real goods and services. So here I'm going to quote again from Say, and then I'll paraphrase to make sure you understand what he's trying to communicate. So this is now Say. You say you only want money. I say you want other commodities and not money. For what, in point of fact, do you want the money? Is it not for the purchase of raw materials or stock for your trade or victuals for your support? So just to be clear, Say is now talking to the business person who had complained about his customers not having enough money. Back to Say. Wherefore, it is products that you want and not money. For, after all, money is but the agent of the transfer of values. Its whole utility has consisted in conveying to your hands the value of the commodities which your customer has sold for the purpose of buying again from you. Okay, so I'm ending that quote right there. And by the way, there's a lot of ellipses in these quotes, so these aren't, I'm just grabbing out certain key phrases here. So what J.B. Say is pointing out here is that if you're a merchant and you're lamenting that your customers don't have enough money and that you'd be perfectly happy to expand your operations if only enough cash were coming in the door, Say is saying, hey, think about it. Really, it's not the money per se that you want. It's what you're going to be able to buy with the money. And so in the grand scheme, if you step back, really you're willing to engage in labor and go through all the hassle of running your business and so on, because you ultimately will then be able to get material comforts and so forth. You'll be able to get goods and services from other members of the community. And he says, where did your customers get the money in the first place? They don't have printing presses. No, the way they got the money, which you're wishing they had more of so they could buy more of your stuff, is they must have produced something valuable to other members of the community. And that's how they're supposed to get the money. So Say is putting his finger on the fact that when you peel back the veil of money, if you will, you can see that really what happens in a modern economy is a huge network of exchanges of goods and services, and that the money just helps sort of coordinate it all. All right, so I'm, of course, paraphrasing and adding some nuance, but what I just said there is a very typical classical economics approach to the function of money, that they think of money as just sort of being a lubricant that facilitates the actual, quote, real underlying transactions. And by the way, we still use that terminology to this day in economics, that you can contrast the nominal exchanges versus the real exchanges. So you say, oh, what happened with real GDP growth last year? You're saying what happened to the increase in the output of actual goods and services, not just merely measuring them in money terms. And so there's this idea that things conceived of or couched in money terms is not real. So that word is very suggestive. Later on in the second part of this course for Liberty Classroom, when we cover Mises, we will talk more about how Mises thought it was a mistake, or it was an unfortunate fact that the classical economists tended to diminish the driving force of money in the economy and just to treat money as like an afterthought to be laid on top of the underlying real exchanges, because, as Mises will point out, you wouldn't be able to have these real exchanges happening if it weren't for money. So it's a bit odd to think, okay, what's the economy going to be like in terms of barter? Oh, and now let's just add the money on top of that to get money prices. Okay, but let's now come back to the way Say is trying to motivate this. It is important to have that insight to see there is a sense in which money is facilitating the transfer of real goods and services. And in that respect, really, you don't ultimately want money just for its own sake. You want it for what it can get you. Okay, now we're going to go back and read some more Say here. But it may be asked, if this be so, how does it happen that there is at times so great a glut of commodities in the market? I answer that the glut of a particular commodity arises from its having outrun the total demand for it in one or two ways, either because it has been produced in excessive abundance or because the production of other commodities has fallen short. It is because the production of some commodities has declined that other commodities are superabundant. All right, so let's first, I should probably restate what Say's central insight is here and then come back to handle this possible objection. So again, the big picture, Say is pointing out that ultimately the way your customers demand products from you, the merchant, is they themselves must have previously supplied things to the market, right? Because yes, very narrowly conceived with putting, with tunnel vision, you, the merchant, are just seeing customers walk in the door with money in their pockets. And you say, oh, yes, they have money, so now I'm happy to sell them stuff. But you realize, oh, really, you just want that money so you can go buy things. And then further, you think, oh, you know what? the reason my customers have money in their pockets is because they must have supplied something valuable to the community. So that's where this idea of supply creates its own demand comes from, is that if you are a merchant who is selling shoes and the baker comes in and you say, oh, I wish the baker had more money in his pocket. Well, really what you wish is that the baker could produce more bread, right? You're wishing his output were higher. And so this is the idea where Say is pointing out it can't be that in general everybody is producing too much stuff and there's just not enough demand to go around. That he's saying, why do we have such a higher standard of living now than people 200 years ago? Well, we're all producing that much more, right? That has to be the case. If we're all consuming more per capita than people 200 years ago, it must be because production per capita is much higher than it was 200 years ago. And so this idea that, oh no, in a time of a recession, what happened is business production outran the growth and demand, says, no, that can't be right as a general proposition, because that's the sign of progress. If all these sectors are producing more and more stuff, we have more bread, we have more shoes, and so on. And indeed, the means by which the baker, quote, demands shoes from the cobbler is by producing bread. And so ultimately, people are producing things for their fellow members of the community, and that's the means by which they then demand stuff from other people in the community. So, given that that's now the general framework that Say's developing, he's now entertaining this objection, saying, well, wait a minute, then what's going on in a recession when there's a glut of commodities in the market in general? If the means by which your customers obtain money and then go demand products from you is when they produce, well, it seems then that there shouldn't be a general glut. And Say sort of calls the bluff of that objection and says, right, there isn't a general glut. What I'm saying is that if there's a glut in any particular commodity, so glut meaning excess supply, right? The sellers are trying to sell more units of this particular commodity or service than consumers want to buy of that particular commodity or service. He's saying that can only happen if either that particular commodity, there's been too much production in that one line, or if there's been inadequate production in all the other lines. But he's saying there's an imbalance among sectors. So it can't be, Say believes, that in general all commodities and services are having too much production. He's saying what does make sense, what is possible, is that resources could be misallocated. It's possible that you have too many shoes being produced, not because, oh man, people don't need so many shoes or something like that, or just in general, oh yeah, we have too much stuff, or people need more money so they can go buy more shoes. That doesn't make sense. But what does make sense, Say is arguing here, is to say the reason too many shoes are being produced is that the resources that went into shoe production ought to have been channeled elsewhere. People would have been better off had fewer shoes been produced so that more, loaves of bread could have been produced, or more houses could have been built, or whatever. So it's not, Say is saying there's never going to be a point when we look around the economy and say, oh man, everybody's producing too much stuff. That's not going to happen. No, that's the sign of progress. Hey, everyone's producing more and more stuff. Everybody can consume more. This is great. What could happen is you look around the economy and say, ooh, those sectors right there, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, are producing too much. And then these other sectors over here, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, are producing too little. So yes, there could be imbalances, but it can't be that every line or every sector is producing too much stuff. So that's Say's general proposition. So then what is his policy prescription, given that that's Say's diagnosis for what's happening in a recession? Now I'm quoting from Say. The same principle leads to the conclusion that the encouragement of mere consumption is no benefit to commerce, for the difficulty lies in supplying the means, not in stimulating the desire of consumption, and we have seen that production alone furnishes those means. Thus, it is the aim of good government to stimulate production, of bad government to encourage consumption. Okay, so again, you can see why this is just a dagger in the heart of Keynesianism, if it's correct, that Say is here arguing the people who want to stimulate sales, right, to get money in the pockets of consumers or to do other mechanisms by which to goad people into spending more, he says that's silly. It's never a problem to get people to want to consume more. No, the true economic problem is production. Right? The difficulty is making more houses and making more stagecoaches and more bread and more shoes, given that we have scarce resources. There's not a problem to say, oh, we've got all these houses sitting around. How can we get people to be willing to leave the elements and go into a house? That's not hard. The hard thing for humanity is the fact that we're stuck in a world of scarcity where we can't get everything we want physically. We have to make choices. There's trade-offs. That's what the economic problem is. And so once you realize that, saying it's crazy then for the government to stimulate consumption, that's not the problem. What the government should do is adopt policies that promote production, and then consumption takes care of itself. Okay, so you can see that this spills over into modern disputes. If you're looking at the PowerPoint here, I have some books featured. So William Hutt, W.H. Hutt, has a book called A Rehabilitation of Say's Law. Thomas Sowell has a book called Say's Law and Historical Analysis. And then Stephen Cates has a book called Say's Law and the Keynesian Revolution, How Macroeconomic Theory Lost Its Way. So for the balance of this lecture, let me just explain to you how economists after Say interpreted his reasoning. So the famous shot came from John Maynard Keynes. So in 1936, he linked this notion of, quote, Say's Law to the entire enterprise of classical economics. And so I think it's fair to say that Keynes was the one who sort of picked this hill to die on. Like to say Keynesianism per se rests on the proposition that Say's Law in general is false. That's what Keynes would say. And so what is Say's Law from Keynes's point of view? Well, he says, it means that supply creates its own demand. Sure, it's not worth getting into this particular lecture for the level of detail you guys want or can handle at this point. Keynes does have a pretty specific technical definition of Say's Law that involves math, but it's not. We don't need to get into that right now. What Say's Law means for Keynes in practice is that markets quickly clear, and in particular, there can't be a general glut. There can't be massive unemployment across the economy because all the industries are finding, oh man, we can't move our product. It can't be the case that businesses in general have a fall off in sales and realize, we got to stop and lay off workers because there's not enough demand for our product. If Say's analysis is correct, that diagnosis will never be applicable to the economy. It's always going to be that some sectors produce too much, perhaps, but that means other sectors must have produced too little, and there's no reason for there to be massive unemployment in that world. All right. So Keynes is going to say, no, that analysis is wrong. The classical school is wrong. Just so you know, we'll, of course, mention this again when we cover Keynes formally in the next part of this History of Economic Thought series. But the way Keynes handles the classical school is he says, oh, yeah, those guys were great if we assume full employment. Right, so all the things the classical economists talked about, with the trade-offs involved and so on, that was all correct if we're operating with the backdrop of full employment. But if there's insufficient aggregate demand to maintain full employment, then all bets are off, and a lot of the conclusions of the classical school are simply wrong. That, for example, there is no trade-off. If the government runs a deficit to build bridges, that's not going to withdraw resources and reduce output in other sectors because we had idle capacity. We had unemployed workers sitting around doing nothing. We had all kinds of natural resources that were being underutilized and so on, factories running at half capacity. So you're able to expand output in that environment without suffering trade-offs. That's what Keynes would say. So again, Keynes picked Say's law to be the thing to say this is the difference between the classical free market laissez-faire approach and modern macro, which of course is a Keynesian. So let me explain the way a lot of modern economists who study the history of economic thought and who are Keynesian, or at least fans of Keynes and think he added a lot to macro and helped our understanding, the way they interpret what happened here. So one thing to do, and we'll cover this will make more sense to you when we do Walras, but if you focus on a barter economy, then it's pretty obvious that there can't be a general glut. So if, just think of it in terms of two goods right now. So there's a cobbler and a baker. So the cobbler's selling shoes and the baker's selling bread, and they're just selling to each other. Those are the only two goods in the marketplace. It would make sense to say there could be a glut of shoes. So that would mean at the particular exchange rate of bread for shoes that these people are considering, that maybe the cobbler wants to sell more shoes and buy more loaves of bread than the baker wants to agree to. So in that sense, the cobbler could think, oh man, at the prevailing exchange rate or real price, I don't have enough demand for my product. I want to sell more shoes in exchange for the revenue quoted in terms of loaves of bread, and my customers, namely the bakers, aren't willing to buy as many pairs of shoes as I want to sell at this price. So that's what we mean by saying there's an excess supply or a glut. But notice, if that's true, then mathematically it must be the case that the opposite holds for the baker. The baker is going to have excess demand for his product in that scenario. He's going to say, well, gee, at these prices, my customers, namely the cobblers, are trying to buy more loaves of bread than I really feel like producing. I would have to get more shoes per loaf of bread than I'm getting right now at this price in order for me to sell as many loaves of bread as these cobblers are trying to order from me. So there would be an excess demand for the bread market. So you can see how if you're thinking in terms of pure barter, what ends up happening mathematically is there cannot be excess supply in all the markets. There's got to be at least one market where there's an excess demand, or more colloquial language, there can't be a general glut. There can only be a glut in some markets and a shortage, excess demand, where people are trying to buy more than people are willing to supply in other markets. Right? So John Stuart Mill, for example, that's how he interpreted what Say was arguing. And there's some fairness in that because, again, remember, Say kind of went out of his way to take money out of the picture, to say, yeah, you're selling your stuff for money, but really what you're doing is you're getting the services that the money's going to buy you. So let's think of it in terms of your customers producing real goods and services, and then you producing your real goods and services, and then you go and buy other goods and services, right? So it's not totally out of line for John Stuart Mill to be interpreting Say as really reasoning in terms of a barter economy. However, John Stuart Mill pointed out, in reality, we don't have a barter economy. We have a monetary economy. So one of the goods is money. And once you take into account that more realistic perspective, well, now what happens, or let me put it this way, you can still maintain that proposition we just walked through, where there could be excess supply or gluts in some markets, but not in all of them. There's got to be at least one market where there's excess demand. And John Stuart Mill pointed out, what if that one market where there's excess demand is the market for the monetary commodity? So that satisfies all of the, the math, if you will, of the formal structure. And so you could have everything be consistent with what Say talked about, where there's a general imbalance, there's a sectoral imbalance, and there's a glut in some parts of the economy and a shortage in others. But what if it just so happens that the glut pertains in every single market product sector that were, quote, real goods and services, and the one market where there's excess demand is the money market. So not only is that compatible with what the layperson merchant was complaining about, that lines up perfectly, because the merchant didn't say there's a general glut in money. The merchant, remember, said there's a scarcity of money. So, a more accurate economic term would be shortage. And so, again, John Stuart Mill saying, once we think of it that way, then there could be, there's no reason to suppose a general glut is impossible if you mean it in the sense of a glut in the real goods and services, obviously not in the monetary commodity. So if that's what you're going to do, now Say's law can't be like a mathematical tautology, which it really would be in the case of barter. So let me just be clear, make sure you're not missing that. If you have a barter economy, then Say's law, it has to be true. It's a very deep fundamental point. It's not merely an equilibrium point. It's not saying, prices will adjust to eventually. No. It's like a math thing. Remember that, just thinking about it in terms of two goods. If the baker's selling bread to the cobbler and the cobbler's selling shoes to the baker, and that's it, it doesn't even make sense to say, could they both be trying to sell the other guy more than the other guy wants to buy at that price? You see how that doesn't make sense. If one person's trying to sell more than the other wants to buy, then that means one person on the other side is trying to buy more than the other one wants to sell. It can't be that they're both trying to sell too much of it. And that's true at any price. So the market clearing price, the equilibrium price, is the one that makes the quantity demanded and quantity supplied equal. But the point is, even if you're out of equilibrium, it can't be that that the quantity supplied exceeds the quantity demanded across all markets. That's mathematically impossible. But again, once you allow for one of those markets to be the monetary commodity, now it's possible to have something that looks like what the layperson merchant was complaining about. So if that's now the battlefield over which we're arguing, you can still maintain or defend some version of Say's law, but it's no longer a mathematical proof. It's not something that is true in terms of a tautology. Now you have to make an empirical case and say, as long as prices were flexible, that would eventually clear markets pretty quickly. So, as I say, this argument that I just walked you through, that's what a lot of modern economists who are historians of economic thought but sympathetic to Keynesianism, that's the way they would explain what happened. So, for example, Brad DeLong, I saw him give the history of thought in that way that I just summarized for you. So you can see how they think, the classical economists were sharp guys, they had some good insights, but they were limited. And now we, modern economists, have a much broader viewpoint, and we can see how they assumed certain things, or they got conclusions that were rested heavily on a particular assumption. And once we relax that assumption, we see that the case for government intervention still holds, right? So that kind of mentality. So what do the free market fans of Say do in terms of trying to rehabilitate Say's law from the attacks of the Keynesians? So one thing is, a lot of them will point out and say, look, that phrase, supply creates its own demand, that's a simplistic straw man that, again, superficially, of course, that's false. You can't just produce anything you want and then get a demand for it. That's not true. It means what Say was talking about, that when you think through things in terms of a barter analysis, you can see ultimately when you demand something, you got the means to do it by supplying things to the market. And ultimately, over time, as the economy grows and standards of living rise, what's going on there? Well, every sector is producing more stuff, and it just increases the volume of trade. It's not a problem to say, no, there's a general glut. No, that's what prosperity looks like. That's progress, to say every market is producing more stuff. You might also, if you really want to get technical in this analysis, you could admit and say, okay, sure, at some level of analysis, you can't abstract away from money, and you got to bring that in, and it complicates things. But it's important to first stress the real simple insight that Say brought to bear on the analysis, because the average layperson, the average merchant, It's not like the average merchant went through the logic that somebody like Brad DeLong would go through. It's not like the average merchant thought about a barter commodity with end commodities and said, yes, I see how you couldn't have excess supply in end markets, only in N-1. I see that proposition, but what if the nth market happens to be the money? That's not what the layperson merchant thinks when he says, man, sales are awful. I wish my customers had more money. He's not going through all that. He doesn't get the first cut of analysis that Say laid out way back then. And so the modern free market fans of Say are going to say it's very important for the general public to think through how a barter economy works first to see those essential insights. And then, sure, bring in money, and that complicates things, but you got to start in the simple level first. For an analogy, this is the analogy I'm making here, you could say, if you're starting to talk about international trade and people are worrying about a trade deficit, it's useful, I think, to say or to point out, hey, look at, in the big picture, fundamentally, the way a country pays for its imports is through its exports. So you really don't need to worry about, oh man, what if we keep running a trade deficit and we import all these goods from all these places without them buying our stuff? You can say, well, no, ultimately, when you think through the logic of it, why would other countries be sending us their goodies year after year? Ultimately, it's because they're expecting us to send our products to them. And if it were barter international trade, that would literally always be exactly true. If countries only, if people in two respective countries only traded actual physical goods with no money in being involved, then clearly there wouldn't be a trade deficit, because by definition, each trade, the market value of the other commodity would be equal to the thing that was coming into your country. And so every trade would be equal in terms of exports and imports. And so when you add up billions of such trades, total exports and total imports are always going to be equal. Now, when you bring in money, that complicates things. Then you can have a situation where a country really does import more than it exports, even for long periods of time, because it's issuing financial assets. So you, for example, might be selling bonds that are claims on future dollars, if we're talking about Americans. And so it is true, the United States, even vis-a-vis the rest of the world, not just some particular country, but the whole world is taken as a whole, it is possible for the U.S. to be running a trade deficit for a while. But that's because the rest of the world is piling up financial assets, which are claims on future dollars. Okay, so again, money complicates things, and it is not correct just to say, hey, a country pays for its imports with its exports, end of story. But if you're talking to someone who's never thought through the implications of international trade and has no clue and just has a very naive view of, oh my gosh, we got to promote domestic job growth, so let's put up a tariff barrier and keep out cheap imports, that kind of person needs to hear the slightly false, or let's say inaccurate, statement that a country pays for its imports with its exports. That's leaving out a lot of stuff, but you need to learn that first. And then once you learn that, then you can bring in the subtleties of foreign exchange rates and capital surpluses and all that kind of stuff. So again, back to Say now, it's, I think, appropriate that when you're talking to a new person who hasn't studied economics before, and they want to say, ooh, what goes on in a recession? Is it just because customers don't have enough money in their pockets, to first walk through in terms of barter, to get them to see the essential insight that Say put his finger on, and then sure, you can get more sophisticated and deal with the complications that bringing money involves. So, and then once you get to that point, you say, all right, now that we do have money involved, why is it, how could it be that there's this general glut in all of the other markets and a shortage in the money market, the market for the monetary commodity? Well, it's because prices aren't flexible. That's ultimately, if you have persistent imbalances in quantity, supply, and demand, for some reason, prices are not falling in the markets where there's the excess supply. And so then when you say, well, why isn't the recession being cured? You have to investigate what's holding prices up. Why is the normal price clearing mechanism failing to work in this situation? Because, again, it cannot be, the answer is not, oh, yeah, we just have too much stuff that's being produced. So that essential part of Say's analysis still pulls through. that it can't be that the problem is, oh yeah, we've satisfied all of human wants and now there's no more scarcity. That's not what's going on. The reason a recession is bad, is a crisis, is because the unemployed workers want to have more material goods, right? And so there clearly is just something sabotaging the mechanism by which the market normally takes resources and labor and so on and combines them to make goods and services that people like. Something interrupts that normal process during a recession, and we're trying to figure out what it is. So it's still true, even with these complications of money and so on, that the answer cannot be, oh yeah, we produce too much stuff and we got to wait a little bit for the glut to subside and then we can go back to normal times. No, producing a bunch of stuff would be great. Something else is working there, and free market economists say something is sabotaging the normal flexible price system.